That's enough of the adverts, and it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Sandra JACOBS, who's going to explain to us why cuneiform in Canaan matters. Dr. JACOBS is a teaching fellow at Leo Baeck College and a visiting research fellow at King's College London, having also worked there for 3 years as a network researcher on dispersed Qumran cave artifacts and archives. She will, in addition, be known to many of you as the indomitable reviews editor of our own journal Strata, from volume 28 in 2010 to volume 34 in 2016. She has a wide range of interests in the ancient world, including semantic and philological distinctions in women's worship of Asherah, the legal capacity of women in early Judean extra-biblical records, and the human body and its disfigurement in biblical and ancient Near Eastern sources. Now, I did slightly worry when we invited Sandra to lecture to us whether she was going to choose this last mentioned area of research, disfigurement, on which she did her doctorate at the University of Manchester, and consequently show us some slides, but thankfully not for today at any rate. Instead, Sandra's going to talk to us about another of her research interests, cuneiform, and in particular, the second edition of Cuneiform in Canaan, Cuneiform Sources from the Land of Israel in Ancient Times, published in 2018, updating research originally published in 2006 and adding 6 new finds to the 91 previously identified. Why this is a major piece of scholarly work and, in particular, what it may mean for understanding Near Eastern law codes in the ancient world, of which, of course, the legal framework in the Pentateuch is obviously one such example, we leave for you, Sandra, to explain. Over to you, Sandra.
Thank you. Okay, let's just share the PowerPoint. Okay. Good afternoon or good evening, everybody. Yeah, so if I might begin and explain to you why I think cuneiform in Canaan really matters. The cuneiform script, that is a writing system first developed by the Sumerians around 3200 to 3300 BCE and attested in its earliest stages in pictographic forms at Uruk, Nineveh, and also Western Iran, but also in Tel Brak and Habu Kabira in North Syria, remained in active use from the early Bronze Age until the beginning of the Common Era. Characterized by wedge-shaped impressions and hence its designation cuneiform from the Latin cuneus, the written texts were produced by pressing a cut straight reed into slightly moist clay, which was of course a readily available material in the alluvial plains surrounding the Tigris and the Euphrates. Originally designed for the purpose of record keeping, the cuneiform script later became used for other languages, and in particular for the writing of Akkadian, which replaced Sumerian as a vernacular of Babylon around 2200 BCE. As one of the oldest Semitic languages in the same family as Aramaic, Hebrew, and Arabic, Akkadian is also one of the best attested languages of antiquity, with the corpus of cuneiform tablets nearly equal in size to that of Latin before 300 CE. That is according to Michael Strack. And it is represented in 3 major dialects, namely Old Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian. The use of the cuneiform script in Israel and the Palestinian territories remains one of the earliest explicit indicators of the impact of ancient Mesopotamian cultural transmission from the Middle Bronze Age through to the first millennium. The initial Cuneiform in Canaan publication appeared in 2006 and provided for the first time a comprehensive account of tablets and fragments, and is now superseded by its next generation, which illustrates the 97 cuneiform fragments from over 29 different locations and periods. These tiny and broken fragments, admittedly an incredibly small number when considered in numerical terms in comparison with the hundreds and thousands of more or less complete tablets which are now kept in the museum collections in Berlin, London, Paris and Yale, provide important attestation of knowledge of cuneiform legal traditions and conventions in the southern Levant, specifically in modern-day Israel and the Palestinian territories. What is the importance of these finds, and how do such tiny and broken pieces make a real difference to our knowledge of early Judaism? In the next half hour or so, I am going to explain their potential contribution to two specific areas. Firstly, to the history of ancient law in Aramaic, Akkadian and Hebrew sources from both before and after the Neo-Assyrian period, which was roughly 980 to 681 BCE, and also to the socioeconomic and legal assumptions of the biblical scribes of the Hebrew Bible. For the purposes of this presentation today, I will be focusing on the written legal traditions preserved in the Masoretic text of the Pentateuch. That is the 5 books we all know as Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And I need also to explain that each of the main collections or clusters of laws which are preserved in these books would have also circulated as freestanding written versions and in contemporaneous circulation by the Persian period in the 5th to 4th centuries. Moreover, each of these versions would have been copied and recopied with no precise standardization in spelling or formatting, as we are now able to appreciate from the manuscript variants available from Khirbet Qumran. The 3 groups of laws, the 3 groups of primary laws in the Pentateuch that we will be considering are those, well, actually specifically in the Covenant Code, which is considered to be the oldest collection of laws in the Hebrew Bible, potentially as early as the late 8th or even early 9th century. More noticeably, the legal situations described in this collection replicate the order, the arrangement, and the subject matter of those found in Hammurabi's laws, as David Wright's hypothesis of textual dependence has adequately demonstrated. This superficial closeness is, however, counterpoised by the fact that wholly different legal resolutions are provided in the Covenant Code to those specified in Hammurabi's laws. The second collection, obviously, is the Deuteronomic Code, where the laws are framed in farewell speeches and poems to Moses, which are delivered to the Israelites at the end of his life. These are formulated actually as stipulations of a covenant where the insistence on monotheism, together with the centralization of the cult in Deuteronomic law, are reinforced by means of the restriction of ritual sacrifice to a single site. There is widespread agreement that the affinities of particularly the blessings and cursings in Deuteronomy 28 to 29 share affinities in particular with the vassal treaties of Esarhaddon and are indicative of their dating no earlier than the 7th century BCE. Here, actually, the only real remaining bone of contention in this discussion is whether or not their use by the Deuteronomic scribes was intentionally subversive, as Ido Koch has argued, or possibly not, as Bill Morrow, who I've just noticed in the audience, has suggested. And finally, there is also the priestly strata of law, which includes the Holiness Code and various other parts of Leviticus and Numbers. Their central point of reference is essentially the wilderness tabernacle and its sacrificial cult, where the emphasis on boundary maintenance defines sacred space and time and extends to the realm of food, death, birth, and sexual relationships. These laws are commonly dated to the Persian period in the 5th century, although this is by no means a unanimous consensus. We must also keep in mind what, oh, hold on, I'm going to have to squish my slides are in a mess, so you have to kind of put up with this. We must also keep in mind that each of these written collections were only a fractional part of available practice, given that contemporaneous oral traditions have escaped the radar of our analysis, as Robert Miller has so effectively demonstrated. And of course, there is the question of their historicity. To what extent were the biblical laws enforced or applied in either the late Bronze or early Iron Age Israel and Judah? And to what extent did these requirements represent normative tradition? Here, the difficulties arrive primarily from the absence of extra-biblical evidence, but also from the fact that the formally canonized traditions frequently contradict what is often deemed popular religious practice. As we know, Yahweh and his Asherah were worshipped, at least in Kuntalat Adrud, vis-a-vis the Deuteronomic requirement of monotheistic worship, and where evidence suggests that a number of the biblical laws were ignored, possibly through lack of knowledge or else intentionally disregarded. Such intentional disregard is documented in one significant case of a creditor who was otherwise prohibited from keeping his debtor's clothes as a pledge for more than one day. In 1960, the discovery of an ostracon in the remains of an ancient fortress located in Metzada Yeshvao, 1 mile south of Yavne Yam, preserves an appeal to a local governor by a laborer who claims that having completed his day's work, which included reaping, measuring, and storing grain, then Hoshayahu, son of Shobi, came and took your servant's garments. Vayavo Hashaviyahu ben Shovi, Ba Shovi vayikach et beged avdecha, right? This is the reconstruction of Shmuel Achitov. Here, the identity of the plaintiff, either as a tenant farmer or a conscripted laborer, does not affect the reality that his complaint presumes either that a prototype or variant of either Exodus 22, 24, 26 or Deuteronomy 24, 10, 13 was operational, irrespective of whether the law itself was being flouted. This admittedly rare, if not random, ostraca has no real bearing on whether any of the other Hebrew laws were operational, and nor does it allow us to presume that the biblical codes were likewise the product of law in everyday practice. In the broader context of ancient Near Eastern law, it is also now clear that in the adjudication of damages, whether civil or criminal damages, but particularly as understood as we have it in the Gemara, in the Zikin, in Bava Batra, Bava Kaba, Bava Matzira, etc., that there was a diversity of enforceable rules in any single area of law. And here I must apologize because we're going to just have to skip back in my slides to go back, to Sophie. And here, this was demonstrated by Sophie Lafont in her evaluation of the entire range of provisions relating to miscarriage and abortion, where she demonstrated that this in this one single area, and I quote, the brief picture of Near Eastern sources about abortion show that there is no definitive pattern fitting all of the texts. This diversity of enforceable rules is an essential feature of these laws, unquote. This is not to presume that similarity automatically indicates dependence, as she clarified further. And I quote, the analogy does not establish any connection between these systems, but relates to the judicial patrimony of humankind. A greater number of civilizations protect family and property in a more or less sophisticated way. If we examine how this situation is presented in the Covenant Code, the collection of laws which most closely models Hammurabi's, we find the following. And I'll just whiz on a bit more. Right, so here we have the provisions in in Exodus 21:22 for the loss of life of an unborn child. When two men fight, and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results. Literally, her child comes out. V'lo yihye ason, but no damage ensues. And here the word, this translation is from the NRSV, not the NRSV, the NJPS, where they've put the word other. If other was in the Hebrew, it'd be lo yihye ason acher. But no damage ensues. The one responsible shall be fined as the woman's husband may exact from him. V'natan biflilim, and the payment will be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, i.e. liability for the loss of life of the mother, you will give a life, or the penalty shall be a life for a life. Oh gosh, right. Here, with the publication of Bernard Jackson's Wisdom Laws, a study of the Mishpatim of Exodus 12 to 22, Bernard was, of course, my supervisor. He specifically suggested that the penalty of nefesh tachat nefesh, literally you will give a life for a life, in the covenant code, did not automatically indicate that capital punishment was required, i.e. it was not necessarily that the assailant was to be put to death, but rather that he would be provided to provide a physical living life-for-life replacement, presumably either a very much alive daughter or female slave from his own household. His reasoning was based on the specific resolution preserved in the Middle Assyrian laws. Actually, this was already suggested by Driver and Miles, but not in any particular detail, where the Middle Assyrian provision, MAL 50, had the principle, Kima shali bisha napshate omala. If the fruit of the woman's womb was a girl, he pays on principle for a life for a life. And this, together with a number of other linguistic elements, provides a compelling support for his position. Actually, more than there's a lot more support for this in this than just this language. What is noteworthy here is that when we look at how, for example, Meir Malul translates in actually what is the most recent translation of the ancient Near Eastern laws, when Meir Malul comes to translate this law in MALA 50, he translates this subordinate clause, Kima shali bisha napshate umala, literally, tachat yaldea nefashot yumaleh. And that's just a little screenshot from the volume. In place of her child, he will replace, literally fulfill yimaleh, nefashot yimaleh, i.e. what Malul is doing here is he's translating the Assyrian principle into modern Hebrew by way of its expression that we saw it was written in the covenant code. Let me just go back and show you. So literally, as nefesh tachat nefesh, he's translated MALA 50 here. Tachat yaldea nefashot yubaleh. Okay. But to continue, we are then informed in verses 24-25 that if non-fatal injury occurs, v'natata, which we can take from the previous verse, v'natata ayin tachat ayin, shen tachat shen, yad tachat yad, etc., foot for foot, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, etc., etc. And here we are left with little choice but to concede with Cornelius Houtman's commentary. It's on his volume 3 commentary on Exodus, where he states, for retaliation, it is not the life, the eye, etc. of the offender that is demanded, but the life, etc. of his wife. The same idealism that governs the law in Exodus 21, 26, 27, that is the mistreatment of a slave, male or female, is the same cause for giving them their freedom. That also governs 21, 23 to 25. Extreme caution is required where it concerns the life and corporal well-being of the wife of a fellow countryman. One who violates that rule is going to feel the consequences in the loss or maiming of his own wife. So the equilibrium between the parties is restored. This regulation is especially in the nature of a preventative, notably with reference to Deuteronomy 19:20, which addresses the attack on a man's most precious possession, the woman, the one who could give him offspring, unquote. Now, this is particularly striking in light of the Covenant Code's thematic structure and subject arrangement with those laws from Hammurabi's of Babylon. But in the case of Hammurabi's laws, right, here we are, sorry. In the case of Hammurabi's laws, what we find is something completely different in the same circumstances. If we go to LH 209, we are told, Shuma awilu marat awili machatzma. If an awilu, this is Martha Roth's translation, if this is a man of the highest social strata, strikes a woman of the awilu class, and this is Martha Roth's translation, but really marat awilum is the daughter of awilum, literally. So if a man in the upper class strikes a daughter in this class and thereby causes her to miscarry her fetus, he shall weigh and deliver 10 shekels of silver. But if she should die, i.e. if that daughter of the Awilum should die, they should kill his daughter. So you have vicarious punishment. But if he should cause a woman of the Mushkenu, the lower class, to miscarry, there's a monetary fine of 5 shekels, but if she dies, that goes up to 30 shekels. And if he strikes a slave, an Awilu slave, and causes her to miscarry her fetus, again, there's only monetary compensation of 2 shekels of silver. What we have here is evident throughout Hammurabi's laws, is that social stratification is particularly evident, but it always just really, I find it really striking with the biblical laws. You know, here you have in the narrative framework of the Pentateuch, the Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, who essentially are nothing more than escaped slaves. They have taken this prestigious collection of laws, remodeled it, and suddenly not only they are not slaves, but they are free men. Okay, I just find that particularly striking. But also the fact here as what also what I would like to stress here is that even though David's book on inventing the law, of inventing God's law, how the covenant code of the Bible used to revise the laws of Hammurabi, has been extensively critiqued, and probably I would say the harshest review has appeared actually in Strata, which Meir Maluz wrote actually when I was editing the book reviews. It's actually worth reading out what he's written. The methodical principle I'm trying to formulate here is that the resemblance is adduced in sequence of details, idioms and expressions, underlying ideas, etc., is common to other sources and can be traced in other periods and places. And Wright himself adduces quite a few other sources as possible contributors to the Covenant Code. The close similarity between the Covenant Code and Hammurabi's laws is then indeed mere coincidence. And therefore, there is no justification in pointing to a specific source as the main contributor. In my view, and following the principle of simplicity, many features alluded to by Wright could very well be an expression of general Mesopotamian thinking and common literary conventions. The same structure and sequence of the laws, the same expressions, idioms, and words, verbs, and legal terms were all a shared law all over the ancient Near East along its 3,000 years of history. And actually, this is precisely the point that the late Raymond Westbrook made when he posited his ideal of a common legal culture that spread throughout the ancient Near East. Without wishing to profess to far more recent historical models, such as the spread of Roman law or as of the English common law, I would argue that all the ancient Near Eastern systems belong in varying degrees to a common legal culture, one very different from any that obtains today. At the very least, they shaped a legal ontology, a way of looking at the law that reflected their view of the world and determined the law of the lawmaker, which brings us neatly back to the subject of this lecture, cuneiform in Canaan, and in particular to a very tiny, thumb-sized cuneiform fragment that has been designated Codex Hatzor. And these images were reproduced here with permission from the Israel Exploration Society. So while what we have here is two very tiny fragments, clearly from the Middle Bronze Age, 2nd millennium BCE, but found in controlled excavations in 2010. And according to chemical analysis undertaken by Yuval Goren, it has been confirmed that the fragment was made with local clay, i.e. that it was written in or around the vicinity of Hatzor in which it was excavated. But maybe more importantly, it was not brought into Hatzor from any outside northern Syrian or Mesopotamian site. The laws, in all honesty, are only very, very partially preserved, but it is clear here that they are concerned with the categories of physical damages perpetrated against another person, damage perpetrated against a slave, and the slapping of a slave also. And that's Philip Vukosavovich's transliteration, which appeared also in 2014 of the fragment. Admittedly, this is of little or no relevance to the laws preserved in the Hebrew Bible, other than indicating the presence of cuneiform legal traditions that were extant in a much earlier period. Although I do think we should really, well, we certainly ought right to reconsider David Wright's dating of the Covenant Code between 740 to 640 BCE at the height of Assyrian domination of the West. Of course, we know very little about the diplomatic envoys sent with tribute to Assyria, where this image of Yehu, actually it's not a very good image of Yehu on the black obelisk, but I had a much better image in my monograph. I should have used that, I'm sorry. But there is an image of Yehu or his envoy who is identified on the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III as being from the house of Omri. And obviously that's dated to 841 BCE, where the subsequent conquest of the Northern Kingdom, obviously much later in 722, resulted in the later population deportation of the Northern Kingdom, scattering Semitic exiles throughout the Assyrian heartland. Hold on. With Sennacherib's third campaign to Judah in 701 BCE, we find, however, that the Judean king Hezekiah, as his vassal, was locked up like a bird in a cage, quite deliberately, according to Karen Radner, who convincingly argued, actually at a lecture to this society, when we used to have our lectures at the British at the British Museum, she argued very convincingly that this was a strategic decision to provide an effective buffer zone between the edge of the Assyrian Empire and the Kingdom of Egypt. And obviously, a lot of the absolute state-to-art conversations here on this subject matter have more recently been published by Sean Zieligasta and Avi Faust in this really excellent collection of essays. But also, I think Ariel Bagg's article, Palestine Under Assyrian Rule, is also pretty cool. Right. Upon Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of the Neo-Assyrian capital in Nineveh in 612, the Babylonian army then subjugated the southern kingdom Judah, tearing down the Jerusalem temple in 586 or 587. Outside of the ration list from Nebuchadnezzar's palace for King Jehoiachin of Judah and his entourage, which was published by Ernest Weidner in 1939, little else was known of the Judean exiles who settled in the urban and rural heartlands of Neo-Babylonian Mesopotamia, except, of course, that by the Persian period, entrepreneurial family firms like those attested in the Murashu archives at Nippur were frequently and were regularly employing Judean scribes. Okay, and both Tero Alstola and also Yigal Bloch have examined these extensively in their publications. And why Alstola's is really good is because actually, if you go to the Brill website, you can just download it for free. Anyway, right. That's just by the way. Right. The Murashu archives, spanning the reign of Artaxerxes I, 464 to 424, and Darius II, 423 to 405. The Murashu archive consists of around 750 tablets, so it's quite considerably large, and it identifies 11 Shapiru alphabetic scribes among the 60 or so Judeans mentioned. Just for the record, these were alphabetic scribes writing in Aramaic and speaking, if not also reading, Akkadian cuneiform scripts. And if just to give you an idea of their names and their patronymics, their names, things like Abdiyama, son of Shabbatiah, Akbiyama, son of Ba'uatir, Gadaliyama, son of Rachum Il, Hananu, son of Hananiyama, Hananayama, son of Upla, and Zabadyama. Well, according to Yigal Bloch, they constituted 11% of the total number of scribes in this considerable archive. Clearly, this historical reality also needs to be taken into account in future discussions of the reception of cuneiform sources in the Hebrew Bible also. Obviously, most of the discussion previously has obviously focused on flood narratives, where tablet 12 of the Atrahasis epic and the correlations with the Noah story occur, creation narratives, and things like the conversations are usually restricted to these accounts, but actually they're just as important to legal traditions also. To conclude, our knowledge of the past is far more than the much oversimplified privileging of one discipline, that is archaeology, over another, i.e. biblical studies, or even written sources over material ones. All material sources including texts, are valid elements in our reconstruction of the past and can productively contribute and enable us to reconstruct what Daniel Pioska has suggested we should view as an assemblage of data in the past, where each element in the material and written record can be examined, even when they bear no direct relation to one another, and dare I say, even when they are of hyperbolic or rhetorical value exclusively. And I think I've finished a bit too early, but anyway, we can have more time for questions. I'd like to finish off with a quotation from David Weisberg in his essay, Splendid Truths or Prodigious Commotion, Ancient Near Eastern Texts and the Study of the Hebrew Bible, which was published in his collected essays, Leaders and Legacies of Assyria and the Bible, which I think I have a copy of. There you go, there it is. The sensitive text archaeological study of the Hebrew language of the biblical period, as well as the richness of the cuneiform sources, make it likely that we can discover the multidimensionality and profundity incompatible with the views of those who see composition, editing, and canonization as a one-time act of a later period. This is not, as some would contend, an old-fashioned idea, but rather an elegant, modern methodology suitable for the appreciation of our text. And this is precisely why each new generation of cuneiform fragments matters so much. Thank you. Better stop the screen share. Okay.
Sandra, thank you very much indeed. Absolutely fascinating, and raises, I'm sure, a lot of really interesting questions. Hopefully the chat function was available to all. My apologies. Zoom, meanwhile, does tend to switch things on and off without one's knowledge, so I had to switch it back on again. But hopefully people have worked out that it is now on. Relatively few questions, but perhaps we can continue. It seems to me that you raise at least 3 areas of questioning here. And the first is a philological one. It's to do with cuneiform. Not all of us have an expertise in this, but certainly an interest. The second is the relationship between legal systems across the Near East over quite a considerable period of time. And the third is at a more micro level, the relationship between the finds and, as you were illustrating to us, what is shown in the Pentateuch. There are, I'm sure, many others, but at least there are those 3. If we can start on the philological, and I think it's Carla Sulzbach asks us, or asks you rather, to a question about Akkadian dialects. Carla, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question yourself?
First of all, thank you
for your Carla.
Hi, for your very interesting.
Long time no see.
Yes, absolutely. I was wondering if the 3 dialects differ dramatically and if they are mutually intelligible.
Okay, so they are mutually intelligible. Hello. I forgot your husband's name, Carla. I'm so sorry.
Jules.
Oh, right. Hi. So put it this way. So I guess maybe they're like Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish. If you get one, you can, if you know one really, really well, you can get to the other. I have to be perfectly honest. I am not familiar with the Old Akkadian dialect at all. And my Akkadian training for 5 years 2 years under Fran Reynolds and 3 years under Frans van Koppen was primarily in Standard Babylonian. And I was really lucky because we were with a group. I was in a group of students where every summer we had summer Akkadian reading groups, and we did Middle Assyrian just for me, right? So you can get, they're not incompatible, right? But it just does mean you spend hours and hours with the dictionaries trying to work out which. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, I mean, apparently, if as far as Chinese is concerned, people of one can read, everybody can read Chinese, but cannot understand each other's dialect when spoken. So I'm just wondering if the script would be intelligible for either Babylonian or Assyrian speaker, reader.
I think if you were literate and you could read, it would be. But in all honesty, we don't exactly know how precisely each sign was vocalized. So, you know, that's as best as we can do it. Have to say, Carla, if you haven't seen this already, SOAS have got a fantastic website where you can hear Syriologists speak. So you could even hear the late Victor Horowitz reading.
Oh yeah,
it's amazing.
Oi.
I know, but you can actually hear him if you go to the SOAS site, and it literally, there's about a dozen of them reading different Gilgamesh, everything. Really good, really good. That's just right. Okay.
Could you put that maybe in the chat, the link to that?
I haven't got it on me. I haven't.
No, I mean, if you, because otherwise I'm going to write it down what you just said.
I'd have to go on the internet and find it.
Okay.
Which I can't really do now because
no, of course.
do it right. Yeah. Or I send it to you later.
Okay.
I'll look later and send it to you. Excellent. Okay. Sorry.
So thank you, Carla, for that. There's a suggestion, and that cuneiform script itself, by some, not all, that cuneiform script itself was appropriated by underlying languages to communicate in written form, because otherwise they would find difficulty, but don't necessarily represent the underlying language, like, for example, Canaanite, of which we know almost nothing.
Jonathan, thank you. Right, sorry.
And I wondered whether you had explored that, whether you had a view, say, for example, where you saw cuneiform in Canaan. It wasn't necessarily Akkadian, but it was potentially Canaanite with Akkadian loanwords and an appropriation of the written form.
Okay, so we know that the cuneiform script was adopted for at least, well, according to Irvin Finkel, at least 12 other different languages, including Hittite. And I have to be perfectly honest, that's as much as I know. But you also have to remember that with the advance of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, as this kind of mighty war machine sort of pressed into the west from the east, they, in order to communicate with the people they were conquering, they had to adopt Aramaic as their lingua franca. And here, what I think is actually more important is the evidence we have from cuneiform tablets with Akkadian, Akkadian superscriptions, and also dual alphabetic tablets. And Mario Fales has written most extensively on how Aramaic would become the lingua franca of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the Levant. So I think it's much more relevant that when the Assyrians came, they came in Aramaic. And also think about the account of the Rabshakeh in 2 King. Can't remember the verse numbers. So when the Rabshakeh, the Assyrian
messenger,
thank you, when he came to Judah, right, he has to, he actually says to them, let's speak in Aramaic, because, so, oh, I'm so nervous. So that's basically, I think the spread of Neo-Assyrian tradition, and with it Mesopotamian culture, owes itself as much to Aramaic sources as much as it did to the cuneiform language itself in the early period.
Thank you. We have a question from Philip Kaplan in relation to Hatzor. Philip, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. It was really interesting, and I couldn't help but think of the connection, the parallel with in the Amarna age, where you have these local kingdoms writing to the Egyptian king in an Akkadian dialect that's heavily influenced by Canaanite. But I always imagined that these local centers had substantial scribal schools. And I'm wondering, given that we now have evidence of cuneiform being produced in centers like Hatzor, possibly also Samaria and Jerusalem, whether we can imagine that there are scribal schools in these centers alongside the Hebrew scribes who are learning and transmitting cuneiform.
I'm so glad you brought that up. Thank you so much. It's a great question. And according to the late Wilfred Lambert and also Mayor Malul, they would have, I guess they would have both said quite probably. And these two, in my opinion, are giants, absolute giants, right? And they both argued that not necessarily for cuneiform schools in major Judean towns or Israelite towns, but that knowledge of cuneiform culture would have been not so much continuous, but it would have been preserved in what would become Israel and Judah. But if you're writing a PhD today, you can't possibly argue that at all, because there just isn't evidence of any continuity. And I can see my friend Jonathan Sturkle in the audience, and I have to emphasize the legal traditions that I've just described to you were not directly available to the biblical scribes. The Middle Assyrian law code is only found in 2 sites, miles and miles away in the Assyrian heartland. So they would have had no direct access to the written traditions, right? Certainly not till the Neo-Assyrian period and Neo-Babylonian period. So as tempting as it is I'd love to agree with you, but I don't think we just can't today in an academic climate. If that answers your question.
Thank you, Sandra. And indeed, Jonathan Sturkle has a question for you himself. So, Jonathan, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Sandra. I loved your lecture. I think it was fantastic. Thank you so much.
I included all your random, these are all random, no coincidence, okay?
The question really that I wanted to ask is about your depiction of these, of the early Israelites as released slaves. And I wonder whether you might want to say a little bit more about that in light of Eva von Dassau's work on conceptualizations of citizenship and freedom. I'm thinking here of the Hurrian Song of Freedom, and also her work on Ugarit here. And on a little side note, the work hasn't been published yet, but Wenike Sonnenfeld from Leiden, she's written a PhD dissertation there under Caroline Varsares on Aramaic on Neo-Babylonian tablets in alphabetic script. So in particular, obviously the Al-Yahudu tablets, she's working with Caroline. And it's fascinating, and it's going to be particularly fascinating for those of us who want much of the alphabetic script on those tablets to be Hebrew, because she identifies it all as Aramaic.
Oh, wow.
Which is super interesting. Just wanted to sort of highlight her work there.
Okay, so I have to be completely honest. I haven't read Eva von Dassau's work, but I'll look it up. And obviously, I look forward to reading the Can you send me the references? Thank you.
Sure,
anyway,
no worries.
Because I didn't write them down as you were speaking. And just really to fill out, explain a bit more about the background that Jonathan mentioned to everybody. The Al-Yahudu tablets we have from ancient Babylon came to light about 10-15 years ago from 3 different vicinities around Nippur, Sippar, Borsippa area. And they basically document that they are the legal documents of Judeans exiled into the Babylonian heartland, people with Judean names, and they bear no relevance at all to anything we know in the Hebrew Bible, but they are fascinating in their own right. And you know, the first 100 of them have been published by a very dear friend of mine, 2 actually, Cornelia Wunsch and Laurie Pierce. The second volume of the next 100 has yet to come out, and that volume is from the Scoian collection. So David and Cindy Sofa's tablets have been published, and we've just got to wait now for the Scoian collection to come out. Oh gosh, I woke up this morning with my throat was aching, and I was like, no. Right, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sandra, thank you. By the way, Eva von Dassau has also written interestingly on Canaanite in Cuneiform as well.
Oh, right. Yes, but that article is 2nd millennium stuff, really. So I didn't bring it in so much.
Indeed.
Thank you.
William Morrow has a question. William, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes,
Thank
thank you very much. What a pleasure to see colleagues in a place where we're virtually locked down here in Canada. Sandra, and thank you very much for your paper. My question really is about distribution of texts. As far as I can tell, all of the additional texts from the 2nd edition of Cuneiform and Canaan are from the Bronze Age. The collection from the Iron Age does not appear to have changed. I wonder if you would like to comment on this distribution chronologically.
Okay, well, I agree. The distribution in the Iron Age hasn't changed, but you know, Bill, that doesn't mean it isn't going to. And as we continue excavating and finding, I'm sure there will be more, although in all honesty, we can't say not significantly more. So yes, there is much less of an already small corpus. And, you know, really, I did emphasize 97 tiny fragments is nothing when you consider, I mean, Wilfred Lambert used to say there's over 500,000 broken tablets still left at the British Museum, you know, so this is really nothing of a nothing. But you never know what we're going to find in the future. So wait and see. Okay. I knew you were going to give a difficult question. I just knew. Anyway.
Sagi Millman asks about the Hammurabic laws and the Pentateuchal laws. Sagi, would you like to ask your question? Have I pronounced your first name correctly? I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it.
It's okay. It was pretty close. It's a very common Canaanite name. So no storm in this side of the world. I was just wondering about the differences between the laws in the Pentateuch and the Hammurabi laws, and how it was Judea back then. I guess my question is, how sure are we in the matter of the inflation of the Assyrian? Obviously, we assume that Assyria was an empire. That's why small Judea was influenced by Assyria. But there are differences, and I would like to ask to hear your intake.
Okay, so can I just
about that, please?
Can I just? You want me to talk about the differences?
In terms of different theology and the inflation from Assyria to Judea.
Sorry, I can hear somebody talking, and I don't.
Can,
you might be able to say that this one looks older than the other. So you can get prehistoric drawings, for instance, which are much, much darker than the Sapietic inscriptions and drawings. But that doesn't really.
That's not my voice.
Gives you some sort of relative
no,
date,
so we
but not dating. And it's not just.
I just wondered if you could turn off.
well, I can't find anybody who isn't unmuted. Excuse me.
Inscriptions patinate faster than big sort of bashed ones, hammered ones. But it's all over such a very long period that it's very difficult really to say. And if it's not on the same face, then...
Right.
Got it.
I think Tessa.
Mute everybody, and then I'm going to unmute. So I'm going to unmute Sandra, and there we are.
I think it came from Mrs. Rajak.
Okay, so Sagi, your question was, were you asking him about the content of the two legal collections, or the? What, I couldn't quite hear your question.
I'm more interested about the differences between the law of Hammurabi and Ashnuna and the biblical laws, and the direction of inflation from Assyria to Judea, or the other way around, as the soldiers from Assyria were exposed maybe to other laws. So I would like to hear your intake about that.
Okay, so overall, what you find with the two corpuses between Hammurabi and the Covenant Code is while the Covenant Code provides match for match equivalent on the thematic subject and layout, the biblical scribes go to inordinate length. There is nothing that's identical. Eye for an eye is probably the only thing, and then they're used in different consequences. The biblical scribes, in my view, went to great attention to provide different resolutions throughout. And normally what you tend to find is people like Joseph Fleischman from Bar Ilan will tell you how much more superior, civilized, ethical the biblical laws are.
Sounds like Bar Ilan.
But actually, that isn't always the case. So, for example, in the case of a debt slave, right? A debt slave in Hammurabi's laws goes free after 3 years. But the Eved Ivri in the Mishpatim in Exodus 21, 22, 21, 2-6, right? What happens? He has to work for 6 years. If he doesn't want to be free, he wants to remain indentured, his ear is pierced, etc., etc., etc. So it isn't always the case that the biblical scribes gave a more morally, ethically, touchy-feely, much nicer law. There was considerable attention to providing different resolutions throughout. And this is really interesting because if you think about in the narrative and the mythic sections of the Pentateuch, if you think about in the primeval narratives, right? Eckhart Fram has argued that texts were rewritten and rewritten as an act of subversion where counter traditions were given, and that's exactly what you get when the motifs from the ancient Near myths are incorporated into the primeval narratives. You get them totally subverted. I don't know if that made sense, but the other thing in terms of physical relationship, John Van Seters wrote in his volume, and he wrongly attributed this to Meir Malol, as though the Covenant Code scribes were sitting in a room with a copy of Hammurabi's Codex. Well, first of all, Meir Malol really never said that in his studies in Mesopotamian legal symbolism or anywhere else. But they would not have necessarily seen an original copy of the law. On the other hand, if they were trained anywhere, they would Hammurabi's code was preserved, copied, rewritten in scribal, you wouldn't call them academies, but in priestly training, wherever scribes were trained, laws, omens, things that came in lists were always copied and recopied. So they would have been trained using a list formula that was from the time of Hammurabi's Babylon, even if it wasn't a full list of their laws, the full list of Babylonian laws. And you have to remember, Hammurabi's Codex is exceptional in this. It was a highly prized carved monument, right? It was stolen and taken to Susa, but also, you know, when Ashurbanipal was building his library, he had to have a copy as well. So by the 7th century, it was still a high prestigious document, text, document, still, however you'd like to refer to it. So, but the biblical scribes did not necessarily have even a copy of it. Does that make sense? I don't know if I've made sense, or even, have I answered your question?
I think, yeah, I think you did.
Great, okay.
There might be a mutual influence in a way, or they both were influenced by other texts, or.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. But it really is, as Raymond Westbrook said, there was a common legal tradition. As much as people take pot at this idea, you know, I don't see how there wasn't.
Would you go as far as to say that there is an Ur text, or that there would have been an Ur text? I mean, Hammurabi's Code isn't the oldest by any means of the legal codes in the Near East that we know of, albeit it may be more complete than most. But do you think that there is an original from which the others appear, or perhaps we don't have enough information to know the answer to that?
Oh, I think no. I very rarely have a one-word answer. No, I would never imagine an Ur text for anything, simply because the interface between orality and writing was much closer, and simply because we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls there were always multiple versions. And you know, if 2 scribes, 3 scribes were copying, maybe, you know, no, I would say we're never going to find an Ur text of anything, even though, for example, a lot of what we find in Hammurabi's laws we see earlier in Eshnunna, 150 years earlier. Oh, Rachel, thank you for putting your essay in the chat. Right. Oh, sorry, Anthony.
Not at all. So I think we probably covered the questions on chat. There's some very interesting and helpful additions, and I would encourage everybody to read the chat. I think it probably remains for me to say thank you very much once again, Sandra. It's been an absolutely fascinating lecture, and plenty to think about going forwards. If I can encourage us to show our appreciation in the usual manner, either by virtual or any other means, and say thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.